Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line. The Russians have advanced in the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, have advanced within the settlement of the Vorishne, northeast of Kupiansk, have advanced across the Cerberus River line in the direction of Liman, making a significant advance here in the direction of the city, reaching the first line of defense near it. The Russians have also made several advances near Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, and have also managed to advance here in the direction of Pokrovsk, the southwestern parts of it. Starting out in the northern parts in the Kursk region, the Russians have managed to advance west of Malaya Luknia, aligning the front line to the settlements of Viktorovka and Nikolaevka, as Russians have managed to capture all of the forest lines and forest patches east of Kruklenkoe. As such, the Russians have now begun the Battle of Malaya Luknia and the river line here near Luknia. The Russians have also managed to capture a fortified position of the Ukrainians southeast of Leonidivka. With this, Russians have gained full control over the four settlements along Zeleny Shlech to Alexandrivka and are now attacking the entire river line near Luknia. This will allow the Russians to align the front line to the northwest of Sudzha and start the battle over settlements such as Lebedivka and Svetlikovo, which are the final villages ahead of Sudzha from the northwestern direction. Therefore, the Russians, while they are fighting in the southern parts of Sudzha, are also closing in on the northern parts of Sudzha from the northwestern direction. The Russians have also managed to advance within the settlement of Kotsitsa as they continue in the western parts of Cherkaskoye Poreshnoe. The Russians in general are launching a general offensive here in the northwestern parts of the Kursk region, as well as in the northern parts following the Ukrainian offensive in the area. Back and forth had happened over the past few months. However, now the momentum is decisively in favor of the Russians. The Russian offensive operations in the southern parts of Makhnovka, here near Sudzha, the Russians have managed to capture the settlement, and this has allowed them to start battle over the river line here near Sudzha. The Ukrainian positions in the eastern bank of the river line are not very significant because the majority of their forces would be within the central parts of Sudzha and on the western bank of the river line. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Russians will make significant advances here within the settlement because they do not have control over the flanks. Instead, the Russians will divert their focus to the settlements around, like Dmitrievkov, Kolmakov, and expanding their bridgehead across the southern parts of the river line near Kohlovka and Milovovi. With this, the Russians will continue offensive operations in the southern flank of Sudzha, attacking the flanks of the settlement rather than storming it directly for much further. At the same time, we see with the main focus of the Russians being in the northern flank of Sudzha that the Russians are looking to align the front line with the Russian-Ukrainian border to the northern flank of Sudzha to push onwards towards the supply lines in and out of the settlement. It is unlikely that the Russians are planning on encircling the Kursk incursion yet. Their plan is first and foremost to allow the Ukrainians to divert as many forces as possible into the Kursk region. This is why they're doing a frontal assault across the front line. They want the Ukrainians to send as much resources as possible. But at the same time, they are doing some of these local encirclements near the front line. This is to inflict as many casualties and destroy as much equipment as possible when they advance. That means instead of doing a general offensive where they encircle the entire Kursk incursion, which could destroy a large Ukrainian force at the same time, they are instead focusing on smaller battles such as the pocket that was located northwest of Pogrebki, where they battle on the flanks of such areas along the front line. This is to limit the supplies going in and out while the Ukrainian forces, if they plan on withdrawing, would be attacked from both flanks, and that would hit them while they are on the move and vulnerable. In turn, if the Ukrainians plan on resupplying their forces, yet again they would have to go through the flanks, which are acting as claws for the Russians, where they really just close the claws whenever the Ukrainian forces attempt to push through. And this has allowed the Russians to take advantage of the weakness of their forces in the area to then gain control of a wider area, forcing a Ukrainian withdrawal, and during the withdrawal they are chasing behind them. Now that the Ukrainians have reestablished their positions in the northern settlements here along the Malaya Luknia River, they are now flanking it from the southern direction, where the other sections of the front line have become more vulnerable due to a redirection of Ukrainian forces and equipment from other sections of the front line to the areas where they are most hardly pressed. But the Russians are not looking to let go any opportunities that appear across the front line, and this has allowed them to make several advances here in the Kursk region. Moving on to the direction of the Verishne, the Russians managed to move into the northern parts of the settlement, following their push through the main bridge here between the eastern and western bank of the Uska river line. Managed to gain full control of it, and with an additional crossing, they're moving on to the northern flank as well. They are lining the front line along the river line to expand their area of which they can supply their forces on the western bank of the river line, and also moving across the river line that moves through the Verishne, splitting it into the northern and southern parts. With this, the Russians have a foothold across both river lines and are fighting over the western parts of the settlement. According to Deep State Map, there is some limited Russian presence in the western parts of the Verishne near Sahunivka. The Russians continued offensive operations on the western bank of the Uska river line, here near Lyman-Pershi and Horobivka, near the Verishne. The Russians also managed to advance on the western bank of the Serbis river line, gaining control over this intersection here and the fortified positions alongside it. The objective of the Russians is to expand the zone of control on the western bank of the Serbis river line and to approach the city of Liman by gaining control over the first line of defense here to the north of the city. With this, the Russians slowly approach the city from the northern direction and also expand their bridgehead across the Serbis river line. Rather than storming the positions of the Ukrainians head-on in the eastern direction, which has faced failure several times, they instead taken advantage of vulnerable positions of the Ukrainians where they really haven't been manning these fortified positions properly, and this has allowed the Russians to gain control of them with little resistance, and this has allowed the Russians to now have control over important fortified positions along the Serbis river line. This protects the Russian bridgehead across the Serbis river line and will allow them to transfer additional forces and to expand their bridgehead as they push towards Bilohorivka and Mirne in the southern parts, which will allow for a wider push towards Yampolivka to gain control over Koletyasi here along the first line of defense and to push upwards in the northern direction to expand in that direction as well, connecting their forces in Makiivka with the ones from Ivanivka. This will significantly improve the Russian positions on the western bank of the Serbis river line and increase the potential for the Russian forces to gain control over this line of defense here along the river line, which will then allow the Russians to push towards Losove and Uskil here along the river line, encircling additional forces of the Ukrainians with only the river line as a crossing for supplies and reinforcements. The Russians have also managed to advance in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar, negating the Ukrainian gains here in the area this month and regaining some of their lost control in the area. The Russians continue fighting the Ukrainians in the forest lines and forest patches here along the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. The Russians have also managed to advance in the western outskirts of Toretsk, reaching the few warehouses there are on the western outskirts near the fortified positions as the Russians get closer to those, which will signify the control over the city for the Russian forces. The Russians have also crossed over the Kryvyi river into the settlement of Novospassky. Before they captured Srebrenivka, the Russians are likely looking to gain control over Srebrenivka and then push and connect with their forces along the fortified positions northwest of Toretsk. This will allow them to gain control over the eastern bank of the river line. But the Russians have also managed to find a weakness in the Ukrainian defensive positions, which allowed them to cross over the river line and now hold a position within the settlement. And this will allow the Russians to slowly gain control over further positions of the Ukrainians in the direction of the reservoir south of Konstantinivka, which will allow the Russians to gain control over the supply lines going in and out of this entire pocket here south of Konstantinivka, which would be extremely vulnerable in case the Russians gain control over Selenopole and Alexandropol in the western direction, and Alexandro Kalinove and Klebenbyk in the northern direction, which will encircle the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces in the area. In the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russians have advanced within Peshane and gained full control over Solone. This allowed for additional advances for the Russians in the direction of the highway connecting Pokrovsk in the east with Zaporizhia in the west, while at the same time their control over the central parts of Peshane leads only a small part under Ukrainian control, following which the road to Svirove will be protected by the fortified positions along the railways. following which the Russians will start to fight over the urban areas that is connected to Pokrovsk itself. The Russians continued offensive operations both in the direction of Pokrovsk and in the western flank. The Russians have also expanded their zone of control, gaining a foothold within Yasenove, following their recent assaults towards the intersection, and with this battle over the final settlement along the highway towards Andrivka from Pokrovsk in the north has begun. And with this, we see that the Russians have made several advances all across the front line. The main focus seems to be in the Kursk region and in the Pokrovsk direction, but we're also seeing a renewed push in the Toretsk direction as Russians look to gain full control of it this month. And the Russians also have been fighting over the southern flank of Chasiv following repeated Ukrainian successes in the area. With the bridgeheads across the Serbis River line and the Uska River line, significant developments are also taking place in the northeastern section of the front line, and the Russians continue their offensive operations in the east and in the north. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.